This is Alex Kane from Life, Sex, and Death and everyone else. You're watching Aftershock TV. This is the only way you should spend your time right now, and you know it.
All right, so this past week, we want to give our condolences here and say rest in peace to famed studio maven Dave Jerden, who passed away at the age of 75. And Jerden, of course, is most famously known for his work on, a lot of classic albums, rock and metal albums in the late 80s and early 90s. Obviously if you look at his career, it's interesting because he even went back to like the early 80s working with like Mick Jagger and the Rolling Stones and stuff. But he's really known. I mean, Red Hot Chili Peppers, he did Mother's Milk. Obviously he did the Jane's Addiction's first two records, their biggest ones, Nothing Shocking and Ritual, Day Little Habitual. He did the first two Social Distortion records, or I should say the first with the self-titled one, as well as the follow-up Somewhere Between Heaven and Hell. He's did, and of course the big ones, obviously Alice in Chains, Facelift. Right. He did Dirt, Last Cracks, Burning Time. I know it's a major record for you. I mean, Anthrax is Sign of White Noise, Armored
Symbol
Saint,
of Salvation,
Sacred Reich's Independent, Biohazard, even Matoleo. Obviously on a lot of great records. Dave Jerden's done obviously over the years. Interesting tidbit too. I saw a little interesting note on him. He was actually initially offered and was going to produce Rust in Peace. I don't know if you heard this.
Oh, I did not hear that. Wow.
He did. And I guess the quote from the engineer of that record, Micah Ryan, I think his name was. He quote unquote said, after a few days, Mustaine said, "I think there's too many guys named Dave around here. We're going to get rid of one of them." Sounds very Mustaine-ish, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, sounds like him. So Jerden obviously was the one that got canned.
I'm surprised it wasn't Ellefson.
I know, right? Well, if he hadn't gotten to that point yet, I guess. But yeah, I mean, so to me, just looking at it, if you look at Jerden's, if you look at his catalog, right, and you look at what he's done over the years, I think what his specialty, what he was brought in to do, if you look at, and I've always said this, we've talked a little bit about this. I remember with Bob, we talked about him when we did that last Crack episode. He was the kind of guy, and get your take on this. He was the guy that would take those harder edge bands and just smooth out the edges and really make them more radio friendly, accessible. I mean, if you look at all those bands that I kind of just mentioned, I mean, even Red Hot Chili Peppers. Let's just look at someone like them. Not a big fan of them, but they were really like a punky, all over the place, funk, punk, whatever, wild freaking band. And then when they did Mother's Milk, that's when they started getting on the radio. They just became more radio friendly. You could say the same thing with Social Distortion. You could say the same thing, obviously. I mean, I don't want to say Alice in Chains because it was their first couple of records, but with Anthrax, Sound of White Noise, right? I mean, perfect example. Even the Biohazard, Matoleo, that wasn't as heavy as the other records. It was a little bit more, radio friendly. So I think that was one of the things he was, I think, a lot of times brought in to do in that time period, late 80s, early 90s, was take these bands that were a little bit edgier, harder, and let's make them more palatable to the masses and make it a little more commercialized.
Well, he was definitely what I would call a commercial producer. He definitely was. But I'll tell you what I think his greatest strength was. This guy was more of a chameleon than any producer I can name of the name guys. And I mean, you named a bunch of bands that fit what me and you like. Look at the stuff that he did that we don't necessarily like. And it's so different. He did the Poe record, the first Poe record, which was very different. He did Stabbing Westward. He did the Darkest Days for Stabbing Westward, almost a Nine Inch Nails knockoff type of a record. He did The Offspring. He did a couple of records with The Offspring. So now he's doing punky type, pop punk type things. He did Goldfinger, another pop punk type of it. This guy had an ability. He did a local band. I'll tell you a quick story. We booked, when I was on the metal show here in Cleveland, we booked this band from, I think they were from Columbus, Cincinnati, or somewhere, called Cringe. And I loved that record. I'll be honest. I wish I still had it because it was a great, like kind of kind of remind me of the first Marilyn Manson record.
Okay.
You know, that kind of sort of Nine Inch Nails, but a little more rhythmic and a little less bleepy and bloopy, you know, and Cringe was just like that. And I remember when we booked them, I was talking to the guys in the band and I was like, dude, where did you record this? You know, I know everybody from every studio in Ohio. And he's like, oh no, we had Dave Jerden come in. I was like, Jesus.
Wow.
I was like, really?
What should they pay for that? Whoa.
Probably a fortune
A lot
because
of money.
it sounded like a Nine Inch Nails record. I mean, this for a local band that was unsigned to bring Dave Jerden in, you got to think that somebody's dad gave up 2 years of vacations to pay for that.
Totally, man.
But they told me about how Jerden like came in and didn't tell them what to do, just listened to them rehearse and then tweaked it to make it what it became. And it sounds like that's what he did. You know, I mean, again, when you look up and down his line of bands that he did, of course there's metal bands, but then there's Pitch Shifter, which is bizarro world compared to Anthrax.
Oh, well, that's right in the House of like Stabbing Westward. It's industrial metal.
Yeah, it is. But I mean, compared to Anthrax or Alice in Chains,
sure,
you wouldn't think the same guy would be doing that.
True.
You wouldn't think the guy would have the same ear to do that. You would think that, I don't know. How sometimes when you got a playlist going and two things play back to back and they just don't work. Mm-hmm. You would think a guy that does nothing but listen to music, that's what would happen to him when he hears something that's out of his wheelhouse. Mm-hmm. And this guy just didn't seem to have that. I mean, how do you produce Sound of White Noise and The Offspring?
That's what I'm saying. He was all over the place. Exactly. Yeah. No, a lot of those old producers did that, though, right? I mean, they did different things. It wasn't like they just. I mean, unless it was like underground stuff, with the Burnses, Randy and then Scott, they did their metal thrash, one did death metal. I mean, these guys were, these are the classic, producers, right? That worked, it didn't really matter what kind of music it was. It was all about like, can you produce hits? I mean, that was the main thing. And I think that's what his job was to do was, like, this band's doing well in the underground right now. We need you to, we want to put them on MTV and we want, because they got a good look or whatever, we want you to go in there and get a couple hits, get it out of them. Yeah. Now I will say one thing. I mean, we've talked about this about Jerden, when we did that, last crack episode years ago, I brought this up and still, I'm not, the guy's passed away and rest in peace. I'm not trying to shit on him. But one thing I've always been critical about Jerden's records is really, I think he took a lot of the sonic nature out of these bands' sound. Like I'll give a great example. All right, I mean, and it could go. I mean, you could look at it different ways. All the bands I mentioned earlier, you can look at. But the best example is Alice in Chains. Mm-hmm. All right, so Facelift. Now, if you listen to Facelift and Dirt, right? Yeah. Okay, I mean, they're very different sounding albums, even though he produced them both, correct? Mm-hmm. Now, the one common denominator, okay, about all the records I mentioned before, and the only difference, okay, is if you listen to Dirt, okay, you're like, wow, okay, so the difference between Dirt and Facelift, right? Dirt's heavier. Sure. It's crunchier, it's heavier. It's because he didn't mix it. Ulrich Wilde mixed Dirt. Right. All those other albums I mentioned to you, he mixed. Sure. I mean, if you could look, I mean, I'm even, like I said, I'm a Social Distortion fan. I am. Mm-hmm. Even those records, if you look at the album after the last one he did, it was so much heavier, like a much crunchier guitar. Huh. He really, just the guitar wise, I always felt like things were really sort of just, like I said, it was very commercial. It was meant for that, his mixing. Mm-hmm. And so that was my only, like I said, complaint with Jerden over the years was just like, and a great example here, it was Perry Farrell. There was a quote I remember he did, and I even brought it. He said when he was talking about when he were doing, I think it was Ritual de lo Habitual. Mm-hmm. He said, I wasn't always sure how he would receive my moves, and I remember waiting for him to look the other way so I could push the sliders on the desk up higher. Right. Bingo. I mean,
Yeah.
that was my complaint when I listened to some of these records. Like later on, I didn't really notice this until maybe the last 10 years or so.
Sure.
I would just sit there and be like, yeah, I wish this was just like the guitars aren't stand out as much. He really blended. His mixing just was different. You know what I mean?
Sure.
It was meant for that. But one more example I use for that too was it was actually the last record he ever produced and mixed. It was the band The Shrine. Now I'm a big fan of this band. I love this band. I've seen them up here, and I mean, they were a great band, and I was a huge fan. They were from Venice, and they got signed to Century Media, and they were more of like a Black Sabbath mixed / Black Flag. They were like a skate punk / stoner, heavy rock thing. You know what I mean? Real a great guitarist in that band. But they had this album called Rare Breed out. I remember I was so pumped because they were starting to really get huge. And then when that album came out, I thought it was going to really put them over the top. And it was just, I mean, it sounded so flat and just, it was terrible sounding.
Right.
It sounded awful. And I hate to say, but the band was done after that. I mean, they think they put out like a 5-song EP on their own label because they got dropped by Century Media. And I haven't seen them since. And it's a real shame because they have a great guitarist in that band. And he was the leader. I don't know what happened to them. But that was my only, like I said, thing about Jerden was I think his mixing was very poor. And I mean, for what he wanted to do, I guess, or what the labels wanted him to do, I'm sure they loved it. But I think that's why he didn't really last past, the mid 90s or whatever there. He didn't really, or late 90s, he kind of disappeared for a long time until he did that Shrine album. And then he just completely fell off he I guess, quit music. But anyway, I mean, amazing career. I mean, I'm not shitting on the guy. I'm just, I guess I'm critiquing him a bit, but I did this before he passed. But anyway, a great producer, and rest in peace to Dave Jerden.
Yeah. I'm just looking real quick, and the Shrine actually has put out music since then.
They put out one EP.
And a bunch of singles, too.
Well, those are singles that were on the EP.
Because the last one was in 2020.
Yeah, that was around the last time they put that EP out, 2021, I think it was. So
I'm not familiar with them, but
yeah,
I'll go back and listen to anything other than the last record, I guess.
Yeah, don't listen to that one. Listen to the ones before that. This is what I would say. Yeah.
I had an interest in music always.
It's always kind of been around me some way, shape, or form.
5 minutes sitting on a drum set, man, change your life.
This is the same black guitar that Marty McFly plays in Back to the Future.
I love the feeling I get in front of the freaking full stack here, just the vibration or something to it.
I'm lucky because I do have a little bit of a tap into the Fu Manchu lore, into the Nebula lore.
In order to keep things going, you kind of have to start playing the game a little bit, like the business game.
Everybody has to get through a day-to-day, and how do you exist and how do you get by?
As far as getting people to commit to bands, it's tough to keep a lot together these days, for sure.
Still sleeping on people's floor, that's still a reality.
Probably also playing with some of the best people I've ever played with. The creative juices don't stop. It just keeps going.
For me, it's just finding a balance of how much time I'm spending with my family versus how much time I'm spending working.
It's this validation that what you're doing actually has merit.
Obviously, we're a little long in the tooth, and we've been doing this for a minute, and now we can kind of do what we want. We don't need a record company. I'll do it myself. I'll do it the way I want to.
Just always be cool. Just be respectful. Those are your people. They're connecting to you on some level, even if they don't look like you.
It's got to happen, or else I'll go crazy. Go crazy one way or another, I might as well, not go crazy if I can play music.
Maybe one day I'll have a Porsche, but until that day, I'll drive a Chevy.
There you go.
All right.
Nice.